Hey, Elizabeth, what's up?
Good to see you.
You too, you too. I love that shade behind you.
Oh, thanks. I'm at my parents' place.
Your parents have excellent taste.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I have some remarks, so we could get started. Thank you all for coming. We're in it for a treat tonight with cartoonist, graphic novelist, and author Gene Luen Yang. We are so happy to have Ruth Tam, a writer and illustrator herself, moderating, and to have a joint event with her DC chapter and with at large, comprising members who don't live near a geographically based chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association. Next year will be the 40th anniversary of AAJA's founding in Los Angeles. AAJA began thanks to a small group of journalists at KMBC TV, the Los Angeles Times, and the Japanese American newspaper Rafu Shimpo. The organization has since grown to some 20 chapters across the United States, as well as in Asia, with nearly 1,700 members, 30% of whom are students. AAJA provides support for Asian American and Pacific Islander journalists and those wanting to enter the news business, with networking, jobs, resources, scholarship assistance, and mentoring for those at each stage of their careers, and awareness of news media and fair access for the AAPI community, and eyes and ears for when media outlets go astray in covering the AAPI community and issues. AAJA and its chapters offer workshops and free events like this one, and another tonight on empowerment and leadership with Dr. Ron Brown out of AAJA Sacramento at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern. I actually plan to attend that. And next Wednesday, AAJA New York will host a panel with Law 360 journalists and its editor-in-chief and managing editor on what it's like to work in legal journalism. And on Friday, January 22nd, we'll have our third book club with journalist Bonnie Tsui discussing her new book, Why We Swim. The moderator for that will be Amy Wu, an AAJA member and avid open water swimmer. Algonquin Books has a 30% promo code for AAJA members, and we hope you can read the book and join us. And if you like this event, want to see more, and are in a position to do so, we hope that you'll consider a small donation to the New York chapter or AAJA National to support scholarships, grants, and make an impact. Now to the event. Gene Luen Yang is the writer of Marvel's new Shang-Chi comic book series, centering on one of the franchise's most popular Asian superheroes. I just got my hands on the inaugural issue and was able to read issues 1 through 3 last night. The movie version with Awkwafina, Michelle Yeoh, and Canadian actor Simu Liu as Shang-Chi will come out next year. Gene's two latest books, Dragon Hoops and Superman Smashes the Klan, just won Harvey Awards, among the comic industry's top accolades for Book of the Year and Best Children's or Young Adult Book, respectively. And both are on numerous best books lists for this year, including by the New York Public Library. Gene's graphic novels, American-Born Chinese and Boxers and Saints, were National Book Award finalists, and he was named in 2016 a MacArthur Foundation Fellow and National Ambassador for Young People's Literature by the Library of Congress. He joins us from California. Serving as moderator tonight is Ruth Tam, herself a writer and illustrator. She is a member of AAJA DC and is co-host of WAMU's food-centric podcast, Dish City. This year, she drew comics on the Black Lives Matter movement for DCist. And her written and illustrated work have appeared in the Washington Post, NPR, PBS NewsHour, and The New Yorker. Many thanks also to Tim Cheng at Marvel for also helping make this event happen. And Chris Chung, this was your idea, so thank you for suggesting it. And also to Gil Fontemoyor, our membership chair, who's the wizard at the controls for tonight's Zoom. Please put yourselves on mute and use the chat function for comments and questions during the discussion. And the final portion will be the Q&A, where you can ask Gene questions directly. Thank you, and I'll hand this over to Ruth now. Enjoy the program. Oh, and Sumi, do you have a question? Oh, it was just a wave.
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Liz. Really excited for this conversation, so much so that my background is the cover of my Shang-Chi 1 issue. I think there are a number of different covers for this, but this is the one I have. It's not really working with the unique background, but that's what it is. That's how excited I am to be here. So I want to thank everybody who's decided to make today's book club a part of their day. I know that we're 9 months into this pandemic and we're dealing with a lot individually, collectively, and I think it just means a great deal that we're all still making space for a conversation about art and storytelling, and really just grateful for the time that we can share together. As Liz was saying, we're going to talk with Gene about Shang-Chi and a bunch of his other work. And I think there'll be opportunity for some audience involvement throughout, and I'll prompt you if you want to answer a couple questions here and there, but we'll definitely have a dedicated space for audience questions towards the end. So feel free to make use of that chat. I would love to hear what you all have been thinking about this series. But before we get started, I do want to play the trailer for this series. We're obviously talking about Marvel's Shang-Chi, which is going to be made into a movie next year. But this is the series, or the trailer for the series that Gene is writing. So let me just share my screen. Love it. Okay. Well, that was super intense, but it kind of brings the series to light. Ooh.
Oops, Ruth, I think you're muted.
Sorry, the audio for the trailer is still playing, but I can't close the window. One sec. Okay, so if you have had the you've gotten your hands on the series, that's what it looks like come to life. And if you haven't yet read the series, that's kind of what it looks like. Gene, thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to chat. Maybe we can start off with, I just kind of want to get a sense of the character. I think most superheroes have a central character, like a bunch of traits that travel with them, no matter who's writing their story, who's drawing their image. For you, Gene, what makes Shang-Chi Shang-Chi?
Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me here. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be here with me. I'm actually in my daughter's room, which for whatever reason has the best Wi-Fi. That's her art in the back right there. But Shang-Chi, I had to tell you, I was not a fan of this character when I was a kid. I remember going to my local comic book shop in like, 5th, 6th, 7th grade and actively avoiding any comic book with Shang-Chi in it. And I did it because, back then I was still kind of, like I still didn't feel super comfortable in my Asian skin. I didn't feel super comfortable with the difference that my cultural heritage made, how it made me different from the people around me. So it just felt weird. It felt weird to be like the Asian kid going into the comic book shop and picking up the comic with an Asian superhero. I don't think I read my first Shang-Chi comic until I might have been in like college or maybe a little bit after college. Marvel did this whole relaunch of a chunk of their line. It was called Marvel Max, where they told stories in a way that was a little bit more adult. And Shang-Chi was a part of that. So I read those comics, and I liked them. I liked them, but I felt like I personally had to go through like I had to kind of figure out myself as an Asian American first before I could go and read this comic about an Asian American superhero. In terms of what actually defines him, I mean, I think it's really like he's like a martial arts superhero that exists in a world with other characters who have these like really supernatural powers, you know? And in terms of the way his martial arts skills are expressed, they vary. So sometimes they tend towards the more supernatural, and sometimes they're much more grounded. Those are all things that, you know, DK Ruan and Philip Tan, the two artists that I'm working with, that we all had to kind of work through and figure out how we wanted to portray him. But at his heart, he really is just like, he's almost like Bruce Lee in the Marvel universe. At least that's how he began, you know.
Got it. Maybe one question for the audience I'm curious about is if you were familiar with the Shang-Chi character growing up, or if the news of Marvel's movie, if that's what introduced you to this character, or if it was this series. How did you first learn about the character, and what were your initial reactions? If you want to type your answer in the chat, feel free, or raise your hand. We can call on you later to unmute yourself if you'd like to share verbally, but that's just something that I'd be curious in learning, because I personally did not know about the Shang-Chi character until relatively recently. I didn't grow up with him, and I think I probably would have had a similar reaction. I think that's so interesting that you shared that, because I think like growing up Asian American, if you grew up in as a minority in maybe a majority white or a majority non-Asian community, you are very much aware of yourself as an outsider, and anything that reminds you of that, you can be very critical of. It makes you feel a little bit on the spot or vulnerable. So would be curious about how people were introduced to that character. So Shang-Chi was introduced in the 70s as a master of Kung Fu. You said that you were first, you were aware of him, but it wasn't until later that you had to kind of come to terms with your Asian American identity before you were like willing to engage with him as a reader. As a writer now though, what do you find to be your relationship with this character? Do you find his Chinese identity something that you're trying to really heavily showcase, or is it something that just happens to be a part of his background? Do you want it to be a background like any other superhero's background, or is it something that like you're really trying to drill down on now that's, you know, you're trying to engage this as an Asian American writer?
Yeah, I mean, when Marvel invited me to pitch for this, I decided to do it. I decided to pitch because I was intrigued by him, you know, and I think really what draws me to him is the fact that he is an Asian American character. Not just that, I think he's probably, I mean, with the announcement of the Marvel movie coming out, he probably is our most prominent Asian American superhero now. And I just felt like it was almost like writing him would be another step in figuring out what it means for me to be an Asian American. You know, like it was a way for me to kind of, I feel like this is true for a lot of writers. We kind of work out our issues on the page. So it just seemed like writing Shang-Chi would be a way for me to do that. I think I definitely did not want to shy away from the fact that he is in between cultures. So before this, you know, like his origin story, the way he was set up in the 1970s, he is actually, he began as the son of Fu Manchu, who is one of the most notorious Yellow Peril villains. And Marvel, like Fu Manchu wasn't a Marvel character. So Marvel held the license for Fu Manchu for a short time. After that, the origin story, after Marvel gave up that license, the origin story shifted a bit, and we had to deal with some of that. But all of that, like I think, you know, he was the son of Fu Manchu. He moves over to the United States, and in the United States, he kind of finds his identity apart from his dad as an American-style superhero, using his, you know, Chinese martial arts skill set. So just by that, he kind of is in between these two worlds. He's in between East and West. And I just thought in all of those ways, he kind of mirrored not just my own experience, but the experience of all of us who are Asian Americans. And it seemed like just, Shang-Chi is a way of exploring that. What does it mean to live in between East and West? But you explore it in a world where they're like flying people and dragons and like zombies and all that kind of stuff. So it seemed fun.
I love that. I think a lot of superhero stories are about multiple identities, right? You've got your public facing persona, and then you have your private alter ego. And that's always kind of an embedded theme in a lot of superhero stories. And then if you layer on top of that, being an immigrant, Superman, you've noted in Superman Clashes the Klan, like an immigrant. And if you layer in all these other other global identities, that kind of complicates those stories for a lot of us. Just looking at some of these audience comments, apologies if I mispronounced anyone's name. Kenichi says, my big period reading Marvel was in the early 90s. To be honest, I only remember Shang-Chi as being a B character, someone who appeared as a guest or in the second story. Steffi says, I wasn't familiar with Shang-Chi until recently, didn't follow the comic world too closely, but I did read Gene's book growing up and really enjoy the representation. Charles says, like Gene, I avoided Shang-Chi. Marvel had stopped publishing Master of Kung Fu when I started really collecting, but I thought he was an anachronism. He first appears in his Kung Fu G costume and barefoot while trying to commit an assassination in London, ditto with Iron Fist. Yeah, so I was gonna save this question for later, but I am kind of multiple minds when it comes to Kung Fu and martial arts. You were saying how one of the central tenets to Shang-Chi is that he's a Kung Fu master. And I feel like, yes, like martial arts, Kung Fu, it's an art form. It's something to respect, to study. But I think when you view martial arts from a Western or American pop culture lens, it's something that we've seen sometimes pigeonhole or otherize Asian characters in pop culture. And it's also something that can be very positive, but I'm sure I'm not the only one in this book club who's been approached by a non-Asian person pretending to be a Kung Fu master or something. And that stems from all these stories. So Gene, I don't know if you felt this way. I've seen your use of Kung Fu and martial arts in some of your other books, notably in American Born Chinese, and the way that it symbolizes like stereotypical Asian caricatures. So I'm just wondering, what your relationship is to martial arts and how you've seen it used in pop culture and how you try to follow that trend or do something that's distinctly different from that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think martial arts is a part of the Asian American stereotype now. And when people think of, Asians and Asian Americans within Western cultures, they often think of martial arts. And that largely is, in some ways, it's sort of a testament to the charisma of Bruce Lee, right? Like if he wasn't such a charismatic actor, if he wasn't such a charismatic person, that wouldn't be a part of it. But growing up, I had that same thing. I remember this one time being on a beach with my brother, and this little kid just ran up to us and started doing kung fu moves, and then ran back to his older brother, and they just had this big laugh about it. So I'm sure, like any Asian American who, especially if you grew up in the 80s or 90s, you probably had some kind of experience like that. So I do feel ambivalent. I do feel ambivalent about martial arts. I think our approach is this. So, to prepare for this book, I did read a lot of old Shang-Chi comics, and they really, like, there are a lot of, they're from the 1970s and 80s, right? So there's a lot of it that was pretty problematic. But there were also things that were really inventive about it, like a lot of the way that different creative teams portrayed the action was really beautiful. Like they came up with incredibly creative ways to portray the martial arts, especially in a still art form like comics. But I do think that part of the appeal of Shang-Chi is the like at least in his early years, is the exoticization of martial arts. That martial arts just seems so different, right, from from like your average American's experience of everyday life. That that in Shang-Chi comics, I don't think the reader was invited to be Shang-Chi. I think the reader was invited to look at Shang-Chi, and his martial arts were a part of that. That's why you want to look at him. You're looking at him the way you would look at a dancer on a stage, as opposed to Spider-Man. I feel like Spider-Man is the exact opposite. When you read a Spider-Man comic, you are invited to be Spider-Man. You're invited to be swinging with him on the, across the New York skyline. You're invited to be with him in the laundromat when he's cleaning his costume. You really are invited to kind of sympathize with Peter Parker. So with Shang-Chi, DK and Philip and I, we really actually wanted to invite the reader not to look at Shang-Chi, but to actually be Shang-Chi, and that's kind of how we dealt with the martial arts thing. Like, martial arts have to be a part of him. It's part of the definition of who he is as a character. But if we could write through the stereotype as opposed to around it, then we could get him to feel like a three-dimensional character, which I do think was lacking in a lot of, those old Shang-Chi comics.
I would love to hear how other people in the audience feel about martial arts, because I always felt until somewhat recently, like maybe even now, that like my feelings about martial arts were like a secret that I had to keep. Like, I can't say anything bad about kung fu movies because like they're the reason why like Asians have a role in pop culture all during certain decades. Like, you think about, Bruce Lee in the 70s or Jackie Chan in the 80s, or like just the weight of Karate Kid in the 90s, and sometimes that's all you have. And I'm wondering if you think that Shang-Chi could help maybe like reclaim martial arts maybe as something to not be just the one story we get to hear. But I don't know if you can do that if his whole thing is martial arts.
Yeah, his whole thing is martial arts.
Pretty nuanced.
I think you have to write through it, right? You have to write through it. You have to like, when the hope is when a reader puts down a Shang-Chi story, that they will not just remember the martial arts. Like, the martial arts is part of it, but they'll also remember Shang-Chi as this three-dimensional character with humanly relatable wants and needs and flaws.
Yeah, that's great. I was looking up the history of Shang-Chi, the character, and as you were saying earlier, he gets introduced into the Marvel comics in the 70s. He's created by these two white comics creators, Steve Englehart and Jim Starlin. And you were kind of mentioning how, when you did research on this series, you read some of those old back issues, and some of it is like not something that maybe would be published these days. I would love to hear you kind of explain more about how his background, was it the foundation for a rich background there, or more of an example of like exotification? He's more of something that we look at instead of can relate to personally. Like, any examples from those back issues that help us understand the context of how this and why this creator or this character was created.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of it is pretty rough. I think a lot of it is pretty rough. The old stuff. The action, like I said, was great, but there were just like, I don't know, man. Like one of the characters in the early Shang-Chi comics, I think he might have even shown up in the second or third issues, is his adopted brother. So he had this adopted brother that his evil father, took from Africa, and he's I guess he's an African Chinese, because he's taken as a baby and trained in kung fu. The dad decides to adopt this kid because he recognizes a quote unquote rage in him, and then he grows up to become this African Chinese kung fu master, and they call him the Midnight Sun, which is just like, all of it is just rough. All of it is rough around, and then Shang-Chi and Midnight Sun have like this crazy fight in New York, and it just ends in a not a particularly PC way, throughout all of that, though, I do think that the good parts of it are like the way the action is portrayed is really masterful, and it's beautiful. But I just think that it's a product of its time, like comics in the 1970s. That's kind of like, they're still trying to figure stuff out. I kind of think that the way modern comic book fans feel about American comics is the way that many of us Americans feel about America in general. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there are parts of it that we really love that define us. Like these comics, like they're a part of my childhood and they define how I see the world. But at the same time, when I look at them with adult eyes from the perspective of 2020, a lot of it is just really, really rough. Like you have to kind of work around it and kind of figure out what's good and what's bad.
Right. And I guess as the writer, I don't know how much you're in the position to decide what you can keep in the past and then bring into the future. I'm wondering, you've worked with iconic characters before with other big publishers. How much creative control do you have with the story arc, and how much is it like, here are the plot points and you kind of have to fill in the details?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, much to Marvel's credit, they really gave us a good amount of creative elbow room. I'm working with a great editor. His name is Darren Shan, and he really does want to, honor the Asian Americanness of the character of the series. So we talked a lot about what we should change, what we shouldn't, and lots of stuff was on the table. Comics in general, like superhero comics, are retconned all the time, meaning they rewrite the histories of these characters all the time. But in rewriting those histories, you have to figure out exactly what you asked about earlier, Ruth. Like, what is the core, right? And a few things that we landed on are the martial arts, of course, but also the fact that his dad is a supervillain. Like, I think early on we decided we had to keep that. Like, that dad had to be a supervillain, right? And like I said earlier, his original father was the very definition of a yellow peril villain. So we talked very carefully about what does it mean to have like a Chinese supervillain that transcends those yellow peril stereotypes and those yellow peril tropes. So I don't know. Like I feel like that was a challenge. I think we make our biggest attempt at getting around that or writing through that in issue number 4, which will be out later this month. But we'll see if people think it's successful or not.
Okay, that's the risk with all creative work, though,
Yeah,
right? You put in this research and history and try to make a calculated and thoughtful choice about what you decide to bring in, and then ultimately it's up to readers to have their own relationship with it. I love the questions coming in. I think we're going to keep some of them to the end, but just because I had asked about your all experiences with Kung Fu, just wanted to highlight what Charles says. He says, in my opinion, Kung Fu in comic books still has a tinge of racism. Every move has a name, which often reflects in ignorance. Yeah, I think, that's something that we've seen in I think you, Gene, in American Born Chinese, like there's the character Chinky, who is like the embodiment of a Chinese stereotype. And there's like this whole sequence where he's like doing Kung Fu and he has all these like ridiculous names for all his moves. And so that's definitely a stereotype that you have twisted in a way and used for your own purposes. So I'm sure folks in this call can recall that if they're familiar with that. So I just want to kind of go off of what you were saying when you decide you're making that decision-making process about what to keep, what to leave in the past. There are a lot of journalists on this call because, we're part of AAJA. Part of the reason why AAJA exists is because we are kind of all organizing to advocate for better coverage of our communities, to promote diversity in our newsrooms. And many of us have probably had the experience of, going up against an editor and kind of asking for a better way to depict stories in our community and not to paint people with broad brushstrokes or offensive stereotypes. Is like, have you ever had, I don't know what the process is like in the comics world. Have you ever had to go up against an editor or against a publisher and be like, hey, I think this needs to go this way, or like, maybe let's not lean too heavily on this character trait. Like, do you have those discussions with publishers in addition to your editorial team? What is that process like, and have you ever had to push back?
So the modern American comic book industry really has these two different sides, right? There is the superhero side, Marvel and DC, and then there's this other side, which today is like graphic novels. But back in the day, it was like considered either underground comics or alternative comics. So underground comics in the 1960s, alternative comics a little bit later. I do think a lot of them at least inspired this current wave of graphic novels that we're seeing today. You know, I think like modern American graphic novels are dominated by middle grade autobiographical stories that have this vulnerability to them that really is inspired by these old like 1960s, 1970s alternative and underground comics. So I came up in that other world, right? The alternative underground kind of do-it-yourself world. Like I started comics by self-publishing. And when you're self-publishing, nobody tells you what to do. You can just kind of do whatever you want. There's no money in it. So because there's no money, there's no rules in it. So I kind of came up in that. The first publishers that I worked with were all in that area. And at that point, like those publishers are just kind of like, they're used to, I feel like they're used to working with a creator to execute the creator's vision, you know? So I never really got any sort of like, with American Born Chinese or any of those other graphic novels, I never got any sort of pushback. And by the time I got into superhero comics, I feel like a lot of that mentality had gotten into superheroes as well. So so at my time at Marvel, I can't think of a single thing that I got pushback on that was sort of political like that. That was about issues of race or anything like that. I can't think of a single thing, right? Like sometimes I would get pushback about things that are continuity related, you know, like, oh, you can't use that character because that character died in, you know, a Spider-Man book. But I don't think I've gotten anything like that. I mean, I do think that one of the things I really love about comics is that they're created by small teams, you know? They're created by very small teams. And because they're created by very small teams, you don't have to get that many people to say yes in order for you to move forward with your story. So I think that like comics can tell deeply intimate stories because of that. And especially in relationship with the movies, right? Like Marvel movies have to have so many people say yes before they're created. A Marvel comic just doesn't have to have as many people say yes. So therefore, like I think comics at their best really are exploring things that would be difficult to explore in other media, in other visual storytelling media, like movies.
I'm wondering if you could expand more on that small team that you are working with. I don't think a lot of people realize just what goes into making comics and how there's someone who handles, you know, the story and the dialogue and the text, and someone who does the art and then the colors and the lettering. And I'm just, you know, you're Chinese American, and the artists in this series that you're working with, you've mentioned, you know, DK Ron, Philip Tan, they're Asian American, and you've worked with all or mostly Asian American teams before. Does the makeup of the team, their backgrounds, does that change the process of producing a comic for you? Or is it more like an act of solidarity in a time where people are more and more conscious of, you know, who's making the stuff that they're producing?
Yeah, I think you know, right now in books in general, there's this discussion around own voices, which is about how there's a discussion about who should be able to tell what stories, right? And I personally, my view of this is that, like, in an ideal world, anybody should be able to tell any kind of story that they want. Like I know how hard it is to write. You know, I teach writers through Hamlin University. I'm part of their NFA program. Most of my students are people who are interested in writing for children and young adults, right? And anybody who's interested in writing a graphic novel, like any student who's interested in writing a graphic novel usually gets shuffled over to me. So I watch my students struggle with fear. I know how hard it is to face that blank page or that blank screen, that blank Word document. And I'm very reluctant to put anything in front of a writer's way when they're writing. So I don't think, like, I think anybody can tell any story. But at the same time, if you are telling a story about somebody who is not like you, who is different from you, you have to approach it with a certain amount of humility and a willingness to do homework, you know? And I think one of the egregious things about the American comic book industry is that, so for instance, for Wonder Woman, a woman writer has lived her homework. She automatically has an advantage to writing Wonder Woman. But the first, like Wonder Woman was created in the 1940s, the first woman to write Wonder Woman didn't get to write her until I think the 1980s, right? And those sorts of stories are just all over the place. So I think the American comic book industry has had a hard time acknowledging the built-in homework that certain members of our community have under their belts. Like, it just makes sense. It makes sense to why I don't think that only African Americans can write Black Panther. It makes sense that you're like an African American writer will have lived his homework for Black Panther in a way that a non-African American writer wouldn't have, right? So it makes sense to go to African American writers first when you're looking for somebody to write Black Panther. So for Shang-Chi, the team that I'm working with was put together by Darren Shan. Darren Shan is an Asian American editor. He's based out of New York, and I'm an Asian American based out on the West Coast. The two artists, one of them is DK Ruan, who's actually Chinese Italian. He lives in Italy. And then Philip Tan is Chinese Filipino, who lives in the Philippines. And then our colorist is Sebastian Chang. I think he's an Asian American. And the cover artist is Jim Chung, who is Chinese Australian. It's sort of like all these members of the Chinese diaspora are coming together to make this book, and it's been a lot of fun. I have to say, one of the big differences that it makes to have like a almost all Chinese blank team, like Chinese American or Chinese Italian team. I think the only one who's not is our letterer. But one of the big differences that it makes is that I have people who are like built-in sensitivity readers, like I'm a Chinese American. I've never lived in China, but Philip Tan, he lives in a Chinese community in the Philippines. He's much more deeply connected to Chinese culture than I am. Like, he can read Chinese, he can write Chinese, he watches Chinese dramas. He's sort of like an amateur Chinese historian. So if I have questions about the dynasties and stuff, I'll be able to ask him. And to have somebody like Philip on the team just makes things go much more smoothly. That homework that I was talking about earlier, it's kind of built into the team because we have all of these different Chinese experiences that are just part of the creative process.
I love that. And yeah, thanks to Charles, who posted a link to Gene's 2014 speech about, doing that homework, if you want to read or watch a video of it later. I just want to close off the Shang-Chi conversation for now and get into some of Gene's other work before we go to audience questions. But one last question that's kind of related to Shang-Chi that I wanted to just double back based on the first thing you said, which was like, oh, when you first encountered Shang-Chi, you avoided him. You did not want to read comics by him. And it's interesting to me now that like, oh, Marvel's first Asian superhero was something that you felt kind of like repelled by. And then now, next year there's going to be the first Asian superhero and it's going to be made into a big movie. And that's something that's supposed to mean something more than just a movie itself. Like, it's supposed to be this big cultural moment. It's supposed to galvanize people. People are supposed to see themselves in that and be, feel powerful or feel seen and not feel ashamed. And that's the difference between when you market a character based on a stereotype versus someone that you're supposed to relate to, I think.
Yeah.
But I do wonder at times what it means to focus this much on representation and pop culture, what it means when, a bunch of fans hitch their wagon to a certain character or a series or movie. And if any of that franchise falls flat in some way or, lands poorly, it can be a big disappointment when you're expecting to feel like validated by what you're watching. And it's also very difficult to create something that's supposed to speak to a huge community that is actually quite diverse. So I'm wondering, what do you think? How much should we be weighing representation when it comes to consuming comics culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think we want to get to a point where we can fail, right? Like we want to get to a point where they're just so like it's so like an Asian American failure doesn't mean the end of Asian American stories. So it's not like an All American Girl, which I thought was a decent show. You all know All American Girl, right? It was the first Asian American sitcom, came out I think in the late 80s, early 90s. It was not a rating success, and that kind of ended all Asian American sitcoms until Fresh Off the Boat came about. So I do think part of getting to that point where we get to fail, we get to be mediocre, is by having movies like Shang-Chi. So like my hope is that we'll have enough Asian American stories out there where we won't have to rely on a single thing to kind of represent all of us, right? Like it's just like the majority culture does not have that. They don't all have to hinge all of their hopes on a single freaking movie. And the hope is that we'll eventually get to that point too.
Right. To be mediocre is to be
Yeah.
mainstream.
Yeah.
So, that's a win, I guess. Okay, so we'll get to all your great Shang-Chi questions in the comments in a bit, but I just wanted to transition more to other work by Gene. This is not okay. So Dragon Hoops, another big project you published this year. Congrats on that. This is a graphic novel that chronicles the varsity men's basketball team at Bishop O'Dowd High School in Oakland, California, where you taught for years as a computer science teacher. The last year that you taught there was the team's one last shot at winning the state championship with a very uniquely talented team. And I think this is your work. This is the first work you've done that's nonfiction, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I know you took some very minor liberties with the narrative, but it is based off of real events, real interviews, and real experiences. Did you view it as a work of comics journalism? And how did you approach this project versus your other ones, which are like entirely fictional?
Yeah, I mean, Dragon Hoops is the first nonfiction book that I did. It's about the Bishop O'Dowd Dragons, a high school basketball team out of Oakland, California during the 2014-2015 season. So that was the team of the school where I used to teach. I taught high school computer science for 17 years. So during my last year at that school, I followed this basketball team around. And I was kind of freaked out. Like when I began that project, I wasn't sure if I was going to do it as fiction or nonfiction. But as I was following the team, I realized, man, there's just some of these things that I'm learning about the team that I'm watching. It just, like if I did it as fiction, nobody would believe it. Like people would think that I was just making it up, because it was just so fantastical. It was so I don't know. Like there's some things that happened during that season that just felt like a Hallmark movie or something, and I just felt like I have to tell it in a real way. And I was really freaked out about it because I think nonfiction graphic novels they're not particularly well developed, at least here in America. And there are lots of questions that I had. Because in a lot of ways, I felt like as soon as you cartoon, you're automatically lying because nobody looks like a cartoon. So by putting that cartoon filter on, you're automatically making reality seem like maybe cuter or simpler than it actually is, right? So I tried to deal with that by putting in extensive footnotes in the back. I tried to deal with that. Like one of the reasons why it became autobiographical was because of that. When I first proposed the book to my publisher, I proposed it as a story about a team over a season. I was not going to be part of it at all. I was just going to focus on the coaches and on the players. But as I realized my own weaknesses as a storyteller, as I realized maybe that the parts of doing nonfiction in comics that I was uncomfortable with, I felt like I had to put myself into the narrative so I could tell these things to the reader directly. So interspersed throughout the narrative is like me working on the book, talking about all the things that I'm uncomfortable with.
Yeah, you really did your homework because there's like 7 pages of footnotes here and like a 2-page bibliography, and it's potentially more than I've ever seen out of a graphic novel like this. So you definitely documented every little detail. There's a semi-meta problem at the heart of Dragon Hoops. I'm not going to spoil it for anybody who hasn't read it, but there's basically a piece of the story puzzle that you're not sure whether you should include or not as the writer of Dragon Hoops. And you've written yourself as a character in the story. Could you talk about the decision to put yourself in the story, not just because you were like, oh, I need to kind of claim all the things that I don't know, but how did you also approach that meta problem and the issue of telling the story fairly and truthfully?
Yeah, so those 7 pages of footnotes at the back, it's like that's 7 pages of insecurity, man. That's like just me pouring my insecurities into those endnotes. The meta problem that you're talking about really is, that was the hardest part of that project. I debated nearly to the very end whether I should put it in or not. Yeah, I like all the way through. Even, I had drawn maybe 80 to 90% of the book, a few months before I turned it in. And even though I had drawn those pieces, I always had this plan B in the back of my mind. Like, if I need to pull this out, I can still try to get the narrative to work by doing these things, by fudging these things, all the way through. And I had multiple talks with my editor about it. Ultimately, though, I went to Coach Lu's house. So Coach Lu is the head coach of that team. And I think it was like in October or November before I turned it in. I turned it in January. And we just sat on his couch and we had this long talk about whether I should put that in or not. And ultimately, but like he was like, it's part of the truth, it's part of the season. You're gonna have to address it in some way. So I ended up leaving it in. But like that's definitely the part of the book that I still feel the most I don't know. I still feel the most nervous about, maybe, or I still feel the most unsure about, like when I think about Dragon Hoops, well, I think about a lot of nights just staying up thinking about how to handle that.
That honestly sounds like the experience, like the night before you publish something big as a journalist. And you're just like lying late at night away, just like, oh my God, like, did I fact check everything? What are the what are the comments gonna say? Like, how can I, how is my career gonna get derailed by this particular piece of work? And I think you've described like an anxiety that a lot of journalists feel when it comes to big pieces like that.
Wait, so what are your coping mechanisms?
I have no healthy coping mechanisms for that particular anxiety. You kind of just have to like you were saying earlier, kind of like you write or work your way through those things. You have to be fastidious about note keeping, and you just have to document yourself. You have to check yourself, and it helps to always have a good editor, obviously. But a lot of journalism is, you've got multiple versions of the truth, and like how many of those narratives are you going to tell to complete one story? And it is like this very delicate equation that you have to put together, and sometimes you're not sure whether you're the right person to do that, and need backup from multiple perspectives to figure out, okay, what components are going to be used in this story, whose voices am I sharing, have I looked at this issue fairly and represented the facts and the questions, in an honest way. And I could see that you've written that struggle into the story, and that's why it really does remind me so much of like comics work, or comics journalism in particular. Another thing that I can relate to when I was reading this book is in the beginning of Dragon Hoops, you're kind of panicking that you've run out of stories to tell before you decide that you're going to do this whole project on the basketball team. You feel like you've run out of stories, and your wife is like, absolutely not. There are stories everywhere. But I'm sure a lot of people on this call can relate to this feeling with writer's block, like a creative burnout, particularly this year. How did you wrestle with that feeling then? And since then, and what does it take to kind of pull yourself out of it?
Yeah, when I began Dragon Hoops, I had just finished this project that had taken me 6 years to do, Boxers and Saints, which is a 2-volume graphic novel about the Boxer Rebellion. And I do think I was feeling some of that creative burnout. Like I was kind of exhausted. But at the same time, my wife and I, we have 4 kids. I can't stop working. I have to keep working. So I was kind of scared. I was scared that I didn't have another idea. And ultimately, in part because of my wife's encouragement, I started looking around and I found this story at my day job that I just, the more I dug into it, the more compelling I found it. It was really scary because I was, up until that point, not a basketball fan. I mean, that's putting it lightly. I was like anti-basketball because I was such a terrible athlete when I was a kid that anytime I tried to play basketball, it was just like the court was this arena of humiliation. I just try to avoid it as much as possible. But the story I found was so compelling that I felt like I had to put it down on paper, and that's what Dragon Hoops is. So it's funny, like I turned in Dragon Hoops at the beginning of 2019. And then since then I've had and I also worked on Superman Smashes the Klan, which came out this year. And then after those two projects like took years of my life to finish. I kind of fell into the same hole again about I was trying to figure out what my next idea was. I remember like calling up my editor multiple times or emailing him like this idea and that idea. And he'd be like, oh, that sounds like a retread of something you did before. I don't know why you're doing that again.
Wow.
Yeah, it's like, he said it. He said, I feel like Dragon Hoops got you into this groove and you're just falling back into that same groove. He said that to me multiple times. So all this year, like all of 2020 until very recently, actually, I've been like pitching things to him or talking to him about things to him, and nothing is really stuck until really recently. I had a couple things stick, but it's scary. I feel like, I feel like when I had I don't know. I feel like before we had kids, the stakes weren't as high. Now it just seems like I think it's really, really scary to like have the welfare of your family rely on inspiration, and inspiration is just a jerk sometimes. It's like an unreliable jerk. So I'm still, I don't know, between my wife and I'm definitely the more anxious one, and I do feel like some of that is rooted in the nature of my work.
Yeah, I mean, creative work is sometimes you can be like a well of ideas and it feels like you never have enough time to complete all the stuff that you want to do, and you just like are brimming with the possibility of creating things, and then sometimes that well is completely dry and it feels like you'll never write or draw again.
Yeah.
And it's really crazy how wildly people can swing from one to the other, and that's unfortunately a constant in the creative process.
Wait, so for 2020, have you found yourself more or less creative?
I think it's only extremes for me, sadly. Like that pendulum that I'm describing is like, we'd be working on 2 or 3 projects at a time and then go months and feel like nothing feels like a story, or like I can't consume ideas the way I was before. I can't like process them as ideas that I can uniquely work on and do something. So it is a struggle. And I think sometimes I felt that way pre-pandemic. And then during the pandemic, I think given that you don't get to go out and seek inspiration the same way anymore, you're really reliant on the inspiration that you can find in your own home or neighborhood, or, whatever small space that you occupy these days. Like that source for creativity is a little restricted, or you have to like look virtually. And, obviously I have access to like books and movies at home and all this other stuff. But it's sometimes when you're feeding off of other people's stories, you're just like, oh, wow, everybody's done all there is. And it's hard to be like, oh, here's a new idea. It's tough. I think that's how I've been thinking about it. That's not, I don't have any tips for anybody, but it's just to say that it's real. I think one thing that, you've been saying how you weren't just not a sports fan, you were a sports hater when you started work on Dragon Hoops because it reminded you of, you know, childhood insecurities and stuff like that. But the process of writing and drawing Dragon Hoops, you know, kind of converted you, and you could see the appeal in it. I think for a lot of journalists, yeah, like there are projects that you work on that shape your understanding of the subject that you're discussing. And I'm wondering if there are other projects that you worked on that changed your idea of the subject itself or formed your opinions on something and they didn't exist before.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true of Dragon Hoops. I think I gained, I had zero appreciation for basketball before that. And now, even though I'm not an expert on the sport, I do understand the appeal. You know, I can watch a basketball game and feel the thrill, which I never could before. And I also understand basketball's place in American history, specifically in the American history of race. I think it plays an incredibly important role. The other book that I had come out this year is Superman Smashes the Klan. And that's a retelling of an old story from the Superman mythos. Back in the 1940s, Superman had this radio show in 1946. On his radio show, he actually took on like the DC Comics equivalent of the Ku Klux Klan. And it's considered one of the most important stories that's ever been told about Superman, because it had an actual real world effect. After that story aired on the radio, the real life Klan actually saw a dip in membership, because nobody wanted to join this organization that Superman had called out on his radio show, you know? So in adapting that book, in adapting that story, one of the features of that original 1940s radio show is that Superman defends a Chinese American family against the Klan, right? And when you can find it on YouTube. It's called The Clan of the Fiery Cross. You can find it on YouTube. When I listened to it on YouTube, I was astounded because, you know, as a Chinese American comic book fan, you know, I've been reading comics for like 30 years now, and I just don't remember seeing that many like characters look like me in Superman stories. So to find out that there was this family of characters who did look like me, who looked like the family that I came from, in this story that dated back to 1946, I was very intrigued. I was also intrigued because I felt like it was a non-obvious choice, right? When you're writing a story where the Klan is the bad guy, your go-to wouldn't be Asian Americans. So I wanted to find out why the writers of that radio show chose to make them Chinese Americans. And that kind of led me into this part of Asian American history that I didn't really know anything about, that really changed the way I saw the relationship between minority communities in America.
I loved Superman Smashes the Klan. Highly recommend if you all haven't read it yet. Why did they decide to make the family at the heart of the story Chinese American?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not for great reasons. It is not for great reasons. So
don't dig too far into history.
Yeah, it's so here's something that I didn't really realize until I did the research that went into Superman Smashes the Klan. You know, to do that book, because it was set in the 1940s, I looked into what life was like for Chinese Americans during World War II, a little bit before World War II, and after. Iris Chang's book was super helpful in this, and what I found was, you know, before World War II, the Chinese or Asian Americans in general, we were not the model minority. You know, like Chinatown was not like the happy tourist attraction that it is today. Chinatown was like where you would go to buy drugs. Like if you really wanted to get mugged, you would go to Chinatown. You know what I mean? Like it was like the really bad part of the city. And then World War II happens, and Pearl Harbor gets attacked by the Empire of Japan, and almost overnight, all of the stereotypes of Chinese Americans completely flip. They flip because after Pearl Harbor, America realizes that our greatest ally against the Empire of Japan are the Chinese, you know, the Chinese living in China. So to kind of build that support, America started telling very different stories about Chinese Americans. So before Pearl Harbor, we were like these criminals, we were drug pushers, we were opium addicts. And almost overnight after Pearl Harbor, we become these hardworking model citizens. Because of that story shift, Chinese Americans were actually allowed in some cases to integrate into white regiments in the American army that went to go fight in World War II. That was not true of anybody else. That was not true of, I mean, it was definitely not true of the Japanese. It was not true of the African Americans. It was not true of anybody except for the Chinese Americans. That's how intensely, like a story flip can change the fate of a community, you know? So after World War II ends, you know, right before it ends, the government introduces this GI Bill, which is like the foundation of the modern American middle class, right? It's what the white middle class is built on. And by and large, African Americans were not allowed to access the benefits of the GI Bill that they had basically earned with their own blood, because the administration of the GI Bill in most African American counties or most African American communities was handed over to these racist boards, local boards. But Chinese Americans, we had it different because of Pearl Harbor, because of that shift in story. So we were actually allowed to use the GI Bill to move into the suburbs. And that was like, this is 1946. So Chinese Americans are moving into the suburbs. Like so many Chinese Americans moved into white suburbs at that time that Chinatowns almost disappeared. You know, like I live in San Jose, California. San Jose used to have a Chinatown. Most American cities used to have Chinatowns, and they cleared out because Chinese were finally allowed to live in places outside of Chinatown. So I think one of the reasons, possibly the major reason why those Klan freaks out about it. So that's probably actually happening, right? That like Chinese Americans, if you talk to Chinese American families who have deep roots in America, who were here around World War II, they'll tell you about that move. We have friends that are like this, and they'll tell you like after they moved, like, you know, sometimes there'd be petitions in these white suburbs to keep the Chinese out, or people would throw garbage on their lawns. But even with all of that animosity, we were still allowed to move, unlike African Americans and Latino Americans and Japanese Americans. So I think that also is that's not only the beginning of the model minority myth. I think that's also the beginning of like the emasculation of the Asian American male. Because like another book that I read maybe a year or two ago was called the Chinatown Trunk Mystery, I think, the Chinatown Trunk Mystery. And it's about this like really seedy murder that happened in Chinatown. Basically, this young Chinese American man was accused of murdering a white missionary woman. And supposedly they had a romantic relationship at the time, right? So this was a sensation in America because the Chinese American man was really good looking and seen as like the sex symbol, you know, like this like dangerous sex symbol. So along with like having Chinatown being the bad part of town, Chinese men were seen as kind of dangerous and also a little bit sexy. So I think after Chinese American families were allowed to move into these white suburbs, the story about Chinese American men became one of emasculation, because the only way it's okay for a Chinese family to move next to you, like if you're a white family, is if you can guarantee that their son is not going to marry your daughter, is not going to date your daughter, right? So I think I think the 1940s was just this really pivotal point, right? Like maybe like some of the tension between African American and Asian American communities can be traced back to that point. The model minority myth can be traced back to that point. The emasculation of the Asian American male can be traced back to that point. It was just like this really intense time. And also our ascent into the American middle class can be traced back to that point as well.
That's super fascinating. Thank you for that brief history lesson. And it shouldn't be that surprising, but it is so interesting how a big part of the American story for immigrant and ethnic communities is like how white America has turned minorities against each other for the sake of kind of like suppressing all of us. And yeah, that's just something that sticks out to me. I did one more question about Superman Smashes the Klan before we head to some audience questions, but you were talking about Chinese American families moving into the suburbs around the time that the radio broadcast was shared and kind of flipped the narrative on Chinese people being kind of like of ill repute and kind of being the neighbors next door. In Superman Smashes the Klan, the Chinese American kids at the heart of the story, Roberta and Tommy, they've moved from Chinatown to the suburbs of Metropolis. And they're kind of in this tug of war between how much they should assimilate with white culture in the suburbs and how much they should define themselves by their Chinese heritage. It's a theme that comes up a lot in your other books. And I think you handle in a really nuanced way and in a unique way in all those different books. And I think a lot of us who are immigrants or children of immigrants these days who are reading graphic novels, we can see ourselves in that struggle. But for kids who are reading these stories who might be further removed from immigration, if their families have been in the country for longer at this point in American history, how do like maybe second or third generation kids, how do you see them interacting with that story of assimilation versus distinction? Is that something you think that kids relate to these days?
Yeah, I'm struggling with that because I'm raising kids like that. You know what I mean? Like I have 4 kids. I'm the child of immigrants and my wife is the child of immigrants, but they're a little bit removed. Like our kids are a little bit removed. And I have these moments of frustration with them sometimes because of this. And we've also made very deliberate decisions about how we raise them. You know what I mean? Like we send them to a school that is predominantly Asian American, and then we live in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's just pretty large ethnic communities all over the place. So a few years ago, there's this great comic book series from Marvel called Totally Awesome Hulk about Korean American Hulk, right? And it's written by Greg Pak. He's a friend of mine, but he's also one of my favorite superhero writers. And Greg writes this amazing scene where all of the Asian American superheroes of the Marvel universe, they get together, right? They fight some supervillains, they get together, and afterwards to celebrate, they go to Korean barbecue. And at the end of their Korean barbecue meal, they have this superpowered fight over the check. And then they go out and karaoke. You know what I mean? And when I read this, like something inside of me like snapped. I was like, oh my gosh, this must be what it feels like for like white kids to read Peter Parker. You know what I mean? Like there must be something that just feels so familiar about this. And I was so excited about it. I immediately like ran to my son's room. He's 17 now. So at the time, I don't know, he's like 13, 14 years old. And I gave it to him, like, you gotta read this. This is amazing. And then he reads it. And then I talked to him about it. And I go, what do you think? And he goes, it was fine. It was all right. And it drove me crazy. I was like, I wanna hire my old childhood bullies to come and bully you just so you'll know like how amazing this book is. You know what I mean? So there is definitely that tension. I do think though that there's a saying about technology that the future is with us. It's just unevenly distributed, and I think that's true of issues of race as well, right? The future is with us. It's just unevenly distributed. I have the really good fortune of being able to visit different communities to talk about the themes of my books, and I can definitely tell you, like different parts of America feel very, very different to the point where, if it weren't for the iPhones and the LCD projectors, it would feel like I was going from one decade to another sometimes when I go from one community to another. So I think that like this discussion that we're having about issues of race, it's going to be with us for a while, and there will be different communities that are going to be at different points in this discussion, but it's going to be with us for a while.
Yeah, I think this is something that a lot of, I have cousins who have kids and they have the same kind of reaction I think that you did, where they try to like, they want to give their kids more than they had, or they want to raise them in a world where their kids can see themselves in pop culture, and for them to never, question that they're a part of American society and that they can see themselves in books, movies, music, whatever. And then like that means something like a movie of Shang-Chi or a movie like Black Panther, that means so much to like people who grew up, who are like a little bit older and didn't have that, but it has like a, I don't know, a mixed effect or something
Yeah.
different for kids that don't know that struggle quite yet, or maybe never will. So it is interesting to me, like reading something like Superman Smashes the Klan and wondering how your reaction to it might be so different depending on how you grew up and how old you are. That's the case with any book, but that's something that really stuck out to me. I'm curious how we were talking about working during a pandemic, and I'm wondering how this past year, how it's affected the way that you work, what you expect from comics and writing during this time. Do you want to write in, like if you were gonna, do you expect that one day like comics, the world of comics will respond to writing about the pandemic as we see it or anything like that? I think we look to comics for escapism a lot of times, but there are elements of reality like sprinkled through. So just curious about where you see this going.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing some of that already. I have a friend named Tin Pham. He's a Vietnamese American cartoonist, and he did a quarantine comic. So for the first 100 days of quarantine, he did a comic a day about the experience. And I do think, I think it'll take a little while. I think we'll need a little bit of distance before we have enough perspective to talk about our experience this year properly. But I definitely think we're going to see a lot of discussion about what came out during 2020 in the future. My guess is immediately after this is over, there's going to be lots of like escapist stuff in celebration of it being over. But then once we get some distance, I think we'll see a lot more reflection about what happened.
Yeah. Let's get to audience questions. They've taken up a lot of time already, but hopefully we can get through some of these quickly. From Liz, Liz wants to know about your research for traveling between different time periods in Chinese history for Shang-Chi, early Qing dynasty to modern day, also all the different locations where Shang-Chi takes place in China. How did you research all those different jumping back and forth between time and between physical space?
Yeah, I mean, some of it I cheated because I relied on research that I did for an earlier project. So I did a bunch of research for about the Boxer Rebellion for Boxers and Saints, which came out in 2013. So for that book, I mean, I went to a library once a week, like a university library once a week, to read for about a year. Every week I'd go for about a year. And then I also visited a Jesuit archive in France to look at photos from that period to get a real sense of what it was like at turn of the century China. So that was like at the very end of the Qing dynasty, right? And part of that research was also looking at the beginning of the Qing dynasty. So for Shang-Chi, I kind of relied on a lot of the stuff that I found out for that. Even beyond that, I mean, for the different locations, some of it was relying on the rest of the team. One of the people on our team lives in Europe, another one lives in the Philippines. So I kind of rely on them. And then Phil, like I said, the guy who lives in the Philippines, he really is like an amateur Chinese historian. So I do also check with him about stuff.
Great. So this is from Raymond. A comparison could be made between Shang-Chi and Luke Cage. What was it about Luke Cage that he was a character that writers were able to drag out of 70s tropes, but Shang-Chi couldn't or hasn't quite yet? I think those 70s tropes, forgive me, Raymond, if I'm putting words in your mouth, but like, I think kind of talking about like blaxploitation tropes from the 70s. Obviously now that we had a Luke Cage Netflix show, so that was able to kind of cross over pretty quickly, not quickly, but before Shang-Chi. So what's the difference there, do you see?
Yeah, I wonder about that. I mean, I do think that they there are a couple of things, right? One is that they divorced him from his superhero name. So Luke Cage, his superhero name is Power Man, and a lot of the tropiness, like a lot of the blaxploitationness about him was attached to that Power Man persona. So they kind of jettisoned that, and they just made him Luke Cage. I think that was a super. That was a very important thing, a very important part of his development as a character. Shang-Chi doesn't have that because Shang-Chi just has one name. You know, he's not like Peter Parker and Spider-Man. He's not like Luke Cage and Power Man. Shang-Chi's actual name and his superhero name are the exact same thing. So I think just that in and of itself makes it a little bit more difficult to separate one thing from the other. And then even beyond that, I mean, Luke Cage's power set isn't necessarily rooted in blaxploitation, whereas Shang-Chi's power set definitely is rooted in a very specific genre that, you know, like Ruth and I, like you and I talked about earlier, it gave rise to all sorts of crazy stereotypes, right? So I think it's a trickier character. I think Shang-Chi is a much trickier character.
That's fair. This is a question from Cesar. Can Gene talk a little bit about the development of the different houses in Shang-Chi's history?
Yeah, that was so the houses. You know, he's part of, like in our version of Shang-Chi, he's part of a secret society called the Five Weapons Society, and that was something like in my research on the Boxer Rebellion. There are all sorts of secret societies in turn of the century China. I think a lot of that just speaks to the turmoil that country was going through at the time. So we did want to bring that into Shang-Chi. I felt like it was authentic to, you know, to that time period. We wanted to root it in the Qing dynasty. And then it also does play with the dynamic that we see in a lot of Kung Fu movies. But the really big thing that we wanted to talk about, like, I think that family is important in every single human culture, but I do think for Asians, there's an added little oomph. You know what I mean? Like in terms of like guilt and obligation and all that kind of stuff. And we wanted to play with all of that. So the houses are sort of an approximation for family. They're rooted in Shang-Chi's family. So when he's interacting with the houses, he's actually interacting with members of his family.
I really love that, like the use of the brother and sister names and titles, and like just like the weird sibling rivalries or like petty arguments or disagreements. Like it did feel very familiar, and I did not identify it as being familiar because it's like an Asian American theme to be close to family, but yeah, it felt, you know, really resonant. Just want to ask another question from Raymond. Which universe has the more interesting China, DC or Marvel?
Ooh, I don't know, man. Like right now I'm writing a series for each of the companies. I don't know if I could pick favorites like that. I think, I'll say this. I think so far I've gotten to play in modern China in the DC universe, and like Qing Dynasty China in the Marvel universe. So the appeals feel very, very different to me. You know, like the China that I've gotten to write in the DC universe is really shiny and new and kind of on the cutting edge of technology, whereas the China that I've gotten to write in the Marvel universe is it's rooted in the research that I had to do, you know, for that other project. So both of those things, I mean, I feel like both of those things together give a more complete picture of what China is actually like.
I'll just ask one more question from me, and then we can go to Liz to close us out. I'm wondering, given that this is a book club organized by AAJA, what you think journalists can take away from the process of making comics? And on the flip side of that, what creative forms, what creative processes do you borrow from as a comics writer?
Yeah, I would love to see visual communication be incorporated more into journalism and into reporting. I think modern audience is just so used to taking in information visually. Like, and that's such a, I feel like at least here in the West, in America, that's such an unexplored area. I'd love to see more people being creative about how do we talk about the real world? How do we talk about nonfiction topics using visual media, and not necessarily just comics, just anything visual, I think is interesting to me. In terms of what I look at in order to inform my comics, I definitely do a lot of reading of nonfiction. Like for Dragon Hoops, I did a bunch of reading of nonfiction stories about basketball history, and I find it just so fascinating. I think I think one of the things I admire most about journalism and about nonfiction writers is the world feels infinite, right? It feels infinite, and you're trying to capture the most poignant picture of an infinite world you can in a finite number of words, in a finite number of images, and in a finite number of pages. It takes a real skill, and it's like, it feels like it really is an art. Like you have to kind of, in a lot of ways, when you make that move from the infinite world into the finite pages, you're relying on your gut. And I think that's just, it's really admirable what you all do.
Thanks, Gene.
Oh, Gene, and I had one last question. Who was the decision between having Sister Hammer be on the cover of the inaugural issue of Shang-Chi?
That's actually the second print. And on the first print, it was Shang-Chi, and then in the second printing, it was Sister Hammer, because she's the principal villain in the first arc. I mean, we hope that she's a sympathetic villain, but she is the principal villain.
Still trying to figure out my feelings about her. Anyway, I know what to add to my own reading list. It has holiday presents. Thank you so much, Gene,
Awesome.
for
Thank
talking with us
you.
tonight about your work and about the comic book industry. Congratulations on all the accolades you have received for your latest Dragon Hoops and Superman Smashes the Klan. And Ruth, thank you for being such an insightful, engaging moderator. You are wonderful. We'll be tuning in to you at WAMU. And another reminder, tonight's Leadership and Empowerment panel out of Sacramento, next Wednesday's Law 360 event, and the January book club event with Bonnie Tway's Why We Swim. Good night. Thank you all, and see you soon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, Gil.
Oh, you're welcome, Liz. My pleasure. Yeah, this was great.
Yeah.
Ah, man, so many good references, and just like his attitude towards like his work. You can tell the amount of output and his prolificness. It really speaks true to his work and who he is.
I really love the ongoing comments in the and I'll be sure to send Anna and Joe and Joe's comment to Gene.
Okay.
Just in case he forgot, he missed it.
Okay.
But,
I actually invited Raymond, so I'm glad he chimed in a lot because I know he's a big fan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome job, guys. It went really well, and the rapport was really smooth and casual, and yet really focused.
Oh,
thank you so much for joining, and so good to see Cece and Leslie and Pearl.
Also, Gil, nice Santa hat placement in your Zoom background.
Oh yeah, I try. Yeah, front and center.
Also, you might want to end recording soon.
Oh yes. Good, Liz. Good.
Awesome.
All right. I think we'll end this. And
okay.
Yeah. Talk soon, guys.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, Liz.
See you, Heather. Bye, Leslie. Good night, Gil.
Good night.
Bye, Pearl.